Hello and welcome to Thoughts on Rice, a podcast hosted by the University of California Cooperative Extension Rice Advisors. I'm one of your hosts, Sara Rosenberg, and I'm a rice farm advisor for Colusa and Yolo counties.
I'm Whitney from DeForest. I'm the Cooperative Extension Rice Advisor for Sutter, Yuba, Placer, and Sacramento counties.
My name is Luis Espino. I'm the Rice Farming Systems Advisor for Butte and Glenn counties.
I'm Michelle Leinfelder-Miles. I'm a farm advisor in the Delta region. I work on all sorts of field crops, grains and forages, but one of those is rice. And the counties that I cover are San Joaquin, Sacramento, Yolo, Solano, and Contra Costa counties.
Together, the UCCE Farm Advisors seek to provide relevant, topical, research-backed information relating to California rice production. Today, I had the privilege to sit down with Sara Rosenberg, who is currently the UCCE Regenerative Agriculture Farm Advisor for Mariposa, Merced, and Stanislaus Counties. Now, there's not a lot of rice in those areas, but Sara spent quite a bit of time working with rice growers in her graduate school experience at UC Davis, where one of her focuses was to understand the barriers to adoption, opportunities, and required resources for successful implementation of crop rotation in rice systems. I've asked her here today to talk about some of that past work in rice crop rotation systems. Hi, Sara. How are you?
How are you? How has everything been?
It's good. I don't know how it is down there, but up here we've been hit by a bit of a deluge. And I know at least the birds, the ground, everything seems pretty happy, and people are okay with it so far.
Are you talking about the atmospheric river that we're having right now? The bomb cyclone, what they're calling it?
Yeah, I saw that, and I was doing some reading, and I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but from the sound of it, it sounds a bit like a hurricane, but just not.
Yeah. But yeah, it just seems like a huge drop in pressure and like just a dump of rain that's going to happen all of a sudden, just at the peak of it. Yeah. So that'll be interesting. I think we're more on the tail end of it over here, so I don't think we're going to see nearly as much as you guys, but it'll still be a lot.
Has it been raining though?
Nope, not yet. Yesterday was warm and sunny. But this weekend's supposed to be pretty bad. So I think we're going to get it. It hasn't hit us yet.
Well, I can tell you from up here. I mean, it's been gray for a few days, and I can tell that people are starting to get a little bit of cabin fever already, because I've had a lot of very long calls from some very bored growers, which I love, but it's interesting to see the shift between in-season phone calls and off-season phone calls.
Yeah, that's funny.
So, Sara, thanks for making the time to be here. Can you tell me a little bit about your background and your education and kind of what led you to this point in your career?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on your show today. I would say that my background was actually more driven towards international agriculture. And it was very serendipitous that I ended up working more locally in California agriculture sectors. I worked in West Africa for over 3.5 years, starting in the Peace Corps. And I spent a lot of time in smallholder farming systems. And a lot of that looks like just working with smallholder farmers to adapt some more of these kind of conservation agriculture practices like cover cropping, minimal tillage, diversification, to their context. It really drove my interest in wanting to deepen my understanding and some of the mechanisms and processes that were happening below the ground and above the ground when doing these practices. And it's kind of what directed me to come back to grad school at UC Davis. I also worked on a number of farms before and in between that for many years. And then I ran my own small diversified farm for a couple years. And then that, left my graduate school experience, which I ended up working in rice. And I came into UC Davis expecting to go back to West Africa. And of course, COVID era happened, and so many people's plans got shifted. And I ended up working on this project looking at how crop rotations affect some of these sustainability factors in rice systems. And I knew nothing about rice actually coming into it. So it was exciting for me to come into this new cropping system. I feel like that background of working with farmers in West Africa and being able to bring that to my grad school experience, and then my grad school experience of working with California farming systems is what kind of allowed me to come into the cooperative extension world and be where I am today.
I'm really glad that you brought up your small farm that you and another colleague kind of ran together when you were in grad school, because most people in grad school, they find enough to keep themselves busy with the coursework and their projects. But you said, oh, I'm going to take on yet another pretty intensive project. So that's really, really cool.
I wouldn't recommend it. It was a lot.
So for those who are interested in going to grad school and farming, I think we can hear it here first. It might be a bit of a challenge, shall we say, to balance.
Yeah.
So let's move on and talk about crop rotation. And so you've kind of touched on this, but a few years ago when you were doing your grad school work, you and your other colleagues, some of whom have actually been on the podcast before, Whitney Brim-DeForest and Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, undertook a comprehensive review of crop rotation in rice systems in California. And so for people who aren't really aware, crop rotation in rice systems in California, it's not terribly common, at least nowadays. It's there's a lot of different reasons as to why that might be, and I'm going to ask you to touch on that later. But can you just tell me what the rationale was behind looking at crop rotation in California rice systems?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just mention this was such a collaborative project. We had pretty much all of the major rice farm advisors, my PI grad at UC Davis, Cameron Pilko, were all involved in this work from the inception. And I think the rationale really stemmed from an IPM perspective, right? Thinking about utilizing these cultural practices for weeds and herbicide resistance issues, which we know is such a huge issue for California rice sector. And there's a lot of, I guess, promotion of crop rotation for those efforts. But like you said, there's not a lot of actual implementation. And so there's certainly was a ton of anecdotal remarks about why growers are not rotating with rice. But we really didn't really know beyond that from the firsthand experience of growers what the rationale was for not rotating. And so that's kind of what drove us into this work and the baseline assessment that you introduced. But the rationale behind starting out was, rotation should be performed to support some of these issues around IPM and weed management. The other thing that came into play, though, was also this side of the narrative around water scarcity events that were starting to come into play more and more in California. And I was working with this crop rotation research in 22 when we saw that huge water scarcity event, and over 50% of rice acreage was fallowed that year in the Sacramento Valley. And so it became kind of this conversational piece of doing this work, realizing that, this is another motivation factor for really investigating some of the impacts of rotations, of having it be another tool for growers to use in times of drought when there might not be enough water to grow rice, but there could be water to grow other crops.
I was actually talking to a grower yesterday, and he told me that he ended up fallowing his ground in 22, and in 23 he actually decided to plant a rotational crop instead in that same rice ground. And one of the reasons behind him actually deciding to switch up was because of some of this work. He directly cited this work that you guys had put out as a reason to look into alternative croppings. So I thought that was really, really impressive.
I love that you have had that experience, and it makes me so happy to hear, just because I think a lot of times we do this work and we don't really see the impact of it very, as much as we would like. So that's really exciting.
So can you tell me a bit about the methodology behind your work on crop rotation? And so I think we just want to kind of touch on the baseline assessment, the first groundwork that you all did to kind of investigate more about crop rotations in rice systems. And we can start there.
Sure. Actually, it's interesting that, like, kind of taking a step back to your original question of how I got here. A lot of the conversations around bringing in grower perspectives, doing these semi-structured interviews, they're not common in agronomic research. And I had been discussing with my PI at the time at UC Davis. I really wanted to engage in more participatory methods of research at that time in the context of going back to Ghana, actually. And so we would have these discussions around how do we integrate growers' perspectives? How do we get their experiences and use that as data to perhaps inform our research better? And we had devised some of that methodology to use in West Africa, but because I never got to go back to West Africa, we ended up using it here. And so what we did was I had the privilege of basically designing a baseline assessment. It's a kind of comparable for a lot of extension work where you need to kind of do a needs assessment, essentially, or an asset assessment of the communities of people that you are working with. And the whole baseline assessment was to inform future research goals, right? So I conducted interviews with like 42 rice growers, I think, throughout the Sacramento Valley. Half of them rotated, half of them didn't. Some of them were organic, most of them were conventional. But it was a form of really learning from their perspective, what their experiences were, and learning about some of the benefits that they experienced with crop rotations if they did rotate, some of the concerns and barriers to adoption if they didn't. And then through all of that, kind of come to an understanding of, well, what are the requirements for rotations to be successful? So that was really insightful. But I think the key point that came out of that, which really drove the next phases of the research, was taking the results back to some of the participants that were involved in the research and some other stakeholders, and presenting the outcomes back to them, and then opening up more of a multi-stakeholder conversation about where do we go from here? What are some knowledge gaps? What further information would we like to know about crop rotations with rice? And having that baseline assessment inform some of those decisions. So out of that baseline assessment came all this other work around economics of crop rotation, soil health, and some of the other stuff that we may get into or not.
So when you brought this information back to the growers, what did you find was some of the key factors influencing the adoption of crop rotation in those fields where people were already rotating?
The interviews really highlighted a number of major barriers in terms of what limits growers' ability to rotate with other crops in rice. And the number one that came out of the rotation or the interviews was really the environments that they were working in. That particularly means the soil, right? And we know that California rice soils are really high in clay, not just being high in clay, but certain types of clay, right? There's these really known clays that are just, we call them one-to-one clays. Generally, the way that the clay soils support rice is that water, we can flood these soils really easily, and it allows for rice to grow there because rice tolerates flooded environments, but other crops don't. So, so, so the clay factor was a really big barrier. The other things involved there was floodplains. So if growers were located in floodplains, usually a combination of factors of being in a floodplain, having high clay soils, or having some type of shallow soil that had a hard pan underneath it would limit their ability to successfully grow other crops. Maybe they could grow other crops, but the success of those crops are going to be quite minimal relative to the success they're getting out of growing a rice crop. The second thing that came out of that was the requirements for rotating with other crops. Oftentimes rice is, we have a large tractor, a few implements for field prep, and then
rice is seeded by airplane, right? Unless you're in the Delta, then it is direct seeded. But in the Sacramento Valley, dominantly seeded by airplane. So the mere fact of not having the correct equipment to grow other crops, right? Not having the tractors, the smaller tractors that are needed for growing row crops, huge limitation. And the other part that is accompanied with that is the entire infrastructure for rice in the Sacramento Valley was really built for rice. So you're growing on these really leveled fields with levees. The infrastructure for irrigation is flooded. So we don't have easy systems, just like it's not really easy to switch over to a sub irrigation system, or furrow irrigation even is a little bit challenging. So all of the factors that have been kind of put into place to make rice feasible and easy makes growing other crops infeasible and very challenging. So on the other side, you could flip that over and you could say, well, those are technically those are the requirements for successful crop rotation. And talking with growers that were rotating and had been rotating for years, they tend to have all those resources. And whether that's because it's just, it's been in their family for generations, or that's just how they started out their operations, they have the correct equipment. They have perhaps more versatile soil, so less constraints on the soil. And they also will put in these other layers where they have developed contracts, markets, and more of the social networking into these markets for them to sell the rotation crops, which are oftentimes missing in kind of these rice-only regions. Yeah, so I think it's a lot of different factors involved. I would say one thing too that was highlighted in my work, which is, the environment was the major constraint. And oftentimes this was seen with growers who had both types of operations, right? If they had fields that were some of the fields that they rotated in, and then they had some fields that were always continuously rice fields. And the major decision-making criteria there was, well, these fields don't grow row crops very well, and these fields do. However, there were certain growers that they did practice rotation on fields that may be considered more rice-specific. And having all of the other resources really allowed them to overcome those environmental limitations. So those are some really important factors that came out of that work.
Well, speaking of available resources, something that also comes to mind, at least anecdotally, is I know there might be a lack of available information about crop rotation in rice. Did you find that was also a factor that was kind of a barrier towards rice crop rotation?
In a way. And I guess what relates to that was the social networking and social asset piece that came into play. Where rotations are occurring in the Sacramento Valley tend to be in more diversified landscapes generally. And so this in the south and Sutter area, certain parts of Sutter and Colusa, where rotations are more popular, growers are kind of surrounded by diversified cropping systems. So there is more options for social networking in those regions. There's more information in terms of finding markets in those regions. And there's definitely more farmer to farmer communication efforts for people to lean on if there's certain knowledge gaps of any kind. And the other side of it, in these really dominant rice growing regions, the culture is really, really heavy focus on rice production. And that really digs into how, the identities of these growers were, and the culture that they're coming from was a really important factor that played a role in it.
Among the rice growers who adopted crop rotation, what were some of the most common rotations that you saw in your surveys?
What I really enjoyed learning about for this work is how diverse people's rotations were. And the sequences were super flexible. So growers were very much adapting their rotations based on market sway, based on the shifts in the markets, based on their weather and their labor demands. And what I found to be dominant was these summer row crop rotations. And a lot of that was using things like tomato, sunflower, which I think has been removed from practice in the Sacramento Valley at this point.
Yeah, most of it's been phased out now.
Mm-hmm. So that was there when I was doing this work, which is too bad that is taken out, because it came about as a really good option for growers. But sunflower, tomato, some of them were rotating with beans and safflower. Wheat was in there as well. And then there were some of these other combinations of cool season crops and forage crops. And a lot of that was more around areas that had more livestock operations in the region. So alfalfa, wheat again, rye, garbanzo beans, those were some of the cool season beans, things like that were integrated. So it was really, really diverse. And it was definitely like every grower had a different sequence and a different factors that led them to pick and choose which crops they were rotating with.
If you could touch on the rice rotation calculator, which was one of the outcomes of your project.
Yes. One of the outcomes of the interviews was that those who rotated suggested that economics was a driving factor for rotation, meaning it was profitable. And those who did not rotate said economics was a leading barrier for why they did not rotate, meaning it was not profitable. And so having these two separate views was a huge kind of focus point that came out of this work. And it became very clear that, well, we need to further investigate some of the economic outcomes of crop rotation in order to better understand how they are both maybe, how these both of these perceptions are coming out, and how they're so opposing from one another. So I, having, not much economics background, dove into this huge undertaking and trying to understand the profitability of crop rotations with rice. And we have a whole lot of data in California in terms of cost of production studies on different crops grown in California, but those are all very much like a snapshot of that one crop. And so it doesn't really give any information from the rice perspective of what it costs to transition out of rice into a rotation crop. And discussing with growers in the interviews, it came about as a lot of the challenges were, like I said, with these resources, the infrastructure for irrigation and not having that set up. And so, of course, when you look at it from an economic perspective, well, there's costs associated with all those things. There's extra costs associated with transitioning to a subsurface drip irrigation, with transitioning to extra bed prep if you're going to build beds for transplanting, with extra labor requirements for doing this labor work. And so we really wanted to ask the question, what are the costs associated with all these extra requirements? And how does that affect profitability when a rice grower is transitioning out of a continuous rice operation into a rotational operation? And so, we held some really successful focus groups with growers to gain some data on the costs that they experienced with some of these things. And then I went into the cost of production studies specifically for these rotation crops like tomato, sunflower, safflower, and beans. And basically did this, accounting sheet where we put down all of the inputs and then looked at profit. And while that was really interesting, what I wanted to be able to have an output that was like a decision support tool for growers to use.
Something practical. Yeah.
Something practical. And I had been inspired from another past UC Davis student who had done something similar with cover cropping in almonds and tomatoes. And there was a cover crop cost decision support tool that was put together online. So I used that model in collaboration with Western IPM and Whitney Brim DeForest and others. We had this crop rotation decision support tool developed, and basically growers can go online, they can pick which crop they're interested in. They have a framework where all of these cost components are already set up, and there's like an average of that's selected based on the research, this average cost put into place. But they have the opportunity to change that cost based on their own context or their own knowledge, and or mess with that cost to see how it might change outcomes. And so it basically pops out kind of a net loss or a net profit if they were interested in switching over. A caveat here is that the decision support tool is a short-term outcome tool, right? And so thinking about how things profitability-wise change over time, this tool doesn't capture that. But it is a really great beginning space for growers to go in and kind of explore the complexity of rotation and how that might translate into profit or loss for them.
I'm glad you noted that caveat, because I think a lot of research out there regarding crop rotation and cover crops in conjunction notes that it takes a long time to see the long-term effects of some of these systems. So that's, I think, something to keep in mind for people who are using this tool, that it's not capturing the entire picture.
Yeah, and then actually what it shows you is basically year one, right? If you're doing all this investment, all the investment costs, what a year one cost looks like, and then it gives you a quote unquote average year. So that does not include some of these investment costs that over time may be reduced. And what else it doesn't provide you, which we did look at in some modeling, was the impact of some of the benefits rotations provide. So if, for example, you're coming back into rice after rotating out for 3 or so many years, you may expect to see a boost in yields. And that was not represented in this calculator. You may also experience a reduction in weeds, perhaps a reduction in inputs. And so that also wasn't captured in this. And so in some of the modeling that we did do economic long-term studies over a period of 15 years with some common, quote unquote, common sequences of rotation. And those benefits had a huge impact on profit. And so it is really this combination of experiencing those benefits as well as the high revenue crops like tomato and, rice is a high revenue crop relatively. But it was really a combination of using these high revenue rotation crops and having these rotational benefits that allowed profit to be realized for a rice grower compared to a continuous rice grower.
Hi, everyone. This is Sarah Marchianish here. Sara Rosenberg and I had such a good chat about crop rotation that we actually ended up going overtime. So I decided to split this episode into 2 parts. The next part will be released next week, so don't fear. You'll be able to hear more from Sara Rosenberg, this time on cover crops, in next week's episode. So please come back next week to hear the rest of this conversation. We have announced the dates for the 2025 Winter Rice Grower Meetings. And so we're going to continue the same format we've had in previous years, having a series of repeating meetings across the rice growing region. So it's okay. In fact, it's suggested don't go to all of them. You'll be pretty bored, but try to make at least one of them. The same information will be presented at all of them. And so I'm going to read off this list of dates, but please keep in mind these dates are on our blogs, on our websites, and our newsletters, so anywhere you need to get more information, go ahead and look for that. Without further ado, here are the dates and area locations for the 2025 Rice Winter Grower Meetings. The specific locations are currently TBD, but here's just the general town they'll be in so you can kind of plan your early spring. February 10th in the morning will be the Woodland meeting. February 12th in the morning will be the Richvale meeting. February 12th in the afternoon will be the Willows meeting. February 13th in the morning will be the Colusa meeting. And finally, February 13th in the afternoon will be the Yuba City meeting. Again, those specific locations are TBD. They will be in those towns, but we will have more information later on, and we will be sure to get that out to all of you as soon as we have that accessible. To learn more about the UCCE Rice program, please feel free to look at our resources, which include the UC Rice blog, the UC Agronomy Rice website, and our newsletters, which are Rice Briefs, which covers Colusa and Yolo, Rice Notes, which covers Yuba Sutter, Rice Leaf, which covers Butte and Glen, and Field Notes, which covers rice in the Delta region. Thanks for listening to Thoughts on Rice, a University of California Cooperative Extension podcast from the University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources. You can find out more about this podcast on our website, thoughtsonrice.buzzsprout.com. We'd love to hear from you. Whether it's from using our text link in the show notes, a survey submission in our feedback form, also in the show notes, or in a comment or rating on your podcast streaming service of choice. You can comment or rate on any service. We will get it, and we would be interested in it. You can also email us with any comments, questions, or concerns at thoughtsonrice@ucdavis.edu. Hopefully everybody gets to breathe a little bit now that harvest is done. And remember, like the growers like to say, have a rice life. Mention of an agrochemical does not constitute a recommendation, merely the sharing of research findings. Always follow the label. The label is the law. Find out more at ipm.ucanr.edu. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the speaker's own, and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the University of California. The material and information presented here is for general purposes only. The University of California name and all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owner, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service.